Hi everybody, Scott Stanchfield here. Let's take a look at what it takes to program one of these services. So I've got this little music player example. We'll see it's showing up here in the emulator. And I've got a little notice up here at the top for the rights for this song because, hey, I got this song for free and they asked for me to give it attribution. I'm going to give them attribution. So let's go ahead and hit play and see what happens. So notice that it's playing music. That's pretty cool. If I hit pause, it pauses the music. Hit play again. It starts where it was. If I hit stop, it's going to stop, and then we can restart. So notice that when it's playing, this little note icon shows up in the notification bar. So if I pull down, I'll see this notification that shows up, and this is a notification required because I made this a foreground service. Anytime you create a foreground service, you have to display a notification to tell the user why there's something running, and that there is something running. I'm going to go ahead and pause. Pauses it. If I hit play, it plays it. If I hit pause again, it's going to send a broadcast to both the service to change the music state and to the activity. So if we take a look at the activity, we should see the activity have a play and a stop button as well. If I come back here and hit play, I should see the pause and the stop button here. Now you're probably hearing a little bit of distortion here. This is the emulator. Sometimes the sound doesn't work all that well. We're lucky that it's not playing the song double speed. Sometimes that happens. So I come up here and hit stop. That closes the service, and we're back to play again over here. This time what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit play and then exit the application. So the music's playing. I'm going to hop out. Note the music is still playing. Now I'm going to actually swipe away the activity to close it. The music's still playing. If I look at the status here, it's showing me the name of it again, and then the icons for pausing and stopping and so on. And so I can still keep controlling. Now if I want to go back in the app, I can go ahead and click on the text over here where I set up another intent to just reopen the activity. Now you notice there's a little bug here. I'm not resyncing the button state when I first reopened this activity. And I just found this when I was starting to record. I'm going to leave it as is. I think the application is close enough to give you the idea of how all this works. In order to make this work, what we need to do is set up, go ahead and pause that so you can hear me a little bit better. So in order to fix this, we need to make sure that when the application starts up, it sends a request off to the service to ask what its current state is, and then the service would send a broadcast back that only the activity is listening for. So the intent filter in the activity would be listening for it, but the intent filter in the service would not be listening. And that would help us sync up the state. Another option would be, instead of using the intents to go back and forth and start and stop, we could make this a bound service as well as a started service, so that when the activity starts, it could bind to it and then use direct communication back and forth. And that actually might be a little bit better. The problem with the intent approach for getting that initial startup is if the service wasn't running, it's going to have to start up the service and then kick back the response. There may be, well, that probably would work, but there might be a race condition in there. That'd be the one thing I'd be concerned about. But nevertheless, I'm not going to do that for right now. So, boom, application's working just like we expected it to. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the code here. First of all, let's take a look at the common file here. These are some constants and things that I'm using between both the service and the activity. So I have a notification channel name. This allows us to group notifications into a group that the user can either turn on or off if they want to. And we have some extras that are going to be attached to intent to tell us which song is actually being played. We have some IDs that we're going to give for the intent. Each of these, when we have the intents for the play button, the stop button, and the pause button, each of them is given a unique ID so that we can replace those if we need to, or update them. These are the intent actions that we're going to use to send our broadcast intents around. And this little helper function here is just going to convert between the action code and the actual string for the action. We'll see where that's used in a little bit. So here's my receiver intent filter that I'm going to be using across both applications. It has action play, pause, and stop are what both the activity and the service are going to be listening for. So let's go and take a look at the service and we'll see what he's doing. So this remote music service. In this particular application, it's running in the same application, but we could have it in an actual separate application instead. So that if our main music player we wanted to have be a component that other people could create different front ends for, they could. So in our music service, I have a little sealed interface here with some object subtypes that are going to be used to keep track of what state we're currently in, stop playing or paused. Note that when you take a look at this source code, I'd recommend looking at these two links here. This guy tells you a really good overview of how the media player itself works, and this one here tells you how you can create a nice media browser service as well as a media browser client. And it's a lot more detailed than what I'm going into here. The point of this example is really to show you how you can use broadcast events and how you can use a started service to do some background work like this. So if we go down a little bit here, we're defining a broadcast receiver that's going to be used to receive some broadcast intents based on that intent filter. If we go back and take a look at him again in the common, our intent filter is saying I'm going to listen for action play, action pause, or action stop. If I see any of those three coming along the pipe, I'm going to accept those into my broadcast receiver. What we're doing in our onReceive is just calling this handle intent function, which is a common function I'm using between the broadcast receiver and the onStart command function. We'll continue down a little bit more here. We have a extension function I'm creating on media player, which is just going to do three things together. Stop if there's music playing, reset, and release. This is just going to reset the pointer in the music to where we are. And then this is going to say, I'm done using this media player. I can go ahead and release any resources that it's acquired. When our service is created, this onCreate is called. And all I'm doing inside here is, first of all, setting up a notification channel. And you don't always need to do this. It's only needed if you're at least version O or not of Android. So this will create the notification channel. And then we're going to use that when we actually create our notifications. This gives the user a way to group the notifications together so they can say, I don't want to hear any notifications for this specific channel. We're also going to register that broadcast receiver so that we can immediately start receiving notifications. Here's the input where we're going to get when somebody says they want to start the service. So if somebody says start service from an activity, it's going to send the intent inside here. In our activity, we're using start service to pass our different commands, our play, our stop, and our pause. So inside here, I'm going to do that same handle intent call. So regardless if we get it from the receiver or the start command, we're going to go to handle intent. He's going to deal with that for us. Finally in here, the end of this, we're saying redeliver intent if the process is killed. Android can still kill this process even though we made it a foreground process. It's much less likelier, but it is possible. And what this will do is this will say if I can restart the service, go ahead and redeliver the existing intent that was their last intent that came in. That might not quite do the right thing, but it should be pretty close. That's another thing that we'd want to look into for if the process is killed and restarted, how we're dealing with the redelivery, how we keep track of what state we were in when we were killed. And probably what we'd want to do there is save things in the shared preferences for this application. So now the big part, let's look at handle intent. Handle intent is getting past an intent from either the broadcast receiver or onStart command. And then inside here, what I'm going to try to do is get the action off that intent. Now, depending on where it was sent from, if it was sent from one of the buttons in the notification, it'll have an intent action. But if it's sent as part of onStart command, it won't have one because onStart command is explicitly saying that I want to start up this specific service. And it's going to pass the service ID rather than having the action defined in there. So in that case, we can actually pick up the action from the extra where we actually set the action explicitly. Once we have that, we're going to take a look inside here and and we're going to see which which action was passed in. Are we being asked to play? Are we being asked to pause? Are we being asked to stop? Now, for being asked to play, it could be a couple different states. We could be paused or we could be stopped. If we're stopped, we're going to start the song over. If we're paused, we're going to pick up where we were. So pause, we're just going to say, hey, Mr. Media Player, if we have one, meaning the question mark dot there, I want to seek to the current position in the media player and call start. Now I'm using apply here. I could have used run as well. Actually, let me change that to run. I think I like the sound of that a little better. Either of those is going to pass in the this into this lambda. Run, I think, sounds a little better. I'm used to apply being used more for just initialization. Because the media player is coming in as this, we have access to current position, seek to, and start directly. We don't have to say media player.seek to, media player.current position. So that's what our pause part's going to do. If we're already playing, we can just completely ignore the play request because we're already doing what it's asking us to do. If we happen to be stopped, this is when we want to actually start a clean run with whatever song they're asking us to play. So we're going to grab the title of the song and the actual song ID from the intent that was passed in and hold on to those. If the current song is -1, that's a bad thing. That means that somebody didn't pass in the song we want to play. For right now, I'm just going to throw an illegal argument exception on that. So then what we're going to do is we're going to call media player create, passing in the service as the context, and in this case, the current song, which is a resource ID. The resource that we're going to use here, if we take a look in this example, is res, raw, and then here's the actual song that we're going to be playing. So we can use that directly. You could also open up a file and play that instead. For this example, I just wanted to bundle it in to make it nice and simple to start the music player. So we're going to create an instance of that media player and start it. That's going to be held onto as media player so that in these other spots we can use it to do our pause, do our stop, and things like that. So now we'll go down a little farther and see what happens when you're asked to pause. If they ask us to pause, we simply say, hey, media player, pause, and then change our state. We also change our state to playing up here. If we're asked to stop, we change our state to stop, and we're going to call stop self. This will stop the service. So this is what lets us basically be done with everything here until somebody restarts us explicitly. So because we're setting this up as a foreground service, we'll keep running until we stop self or somebody explicitly stops us or Android really, really is in bad shape and needs resources that badly. Now, after we handle each intent, I want to update the notification that's displayed at the top of the screen. So I'm passing that in, and let's take a look at what he looks like. So the first thing I'm going to do here is set up the intent to handle, if you click on the body of the note, to go back to the actual music activity. To do that, I'm first of all going to create the intent we would use to say start activity. And I'm also adding some flags in here, clear task and activity new task. This is going to clear the current task, so it's going to wipe out the stack. If you don't do this, we're going to keep stacking up more and more instances of our music activity on top of each other. This is going to start a new task and make sure that it's clear so that we don't have any of that residue laying around. Now, the intent that we would use for our start activity says I'm going to go in this application to the music activity. And the way that we have to set this up inside of the button in the notification is to use something called a pending intent. The pending intent is basically the knowledge of how we want to use that intent. So in this case, if I say get activity, that means I'm going to prepare to call start activity passing this intent in. If I said get broadcast, that would mean I'm preparing to do a send broadcast on that intent. I can then attach this to the notification by saying set content intent, and he's going to look at that pending intent and say, hey, pending intent, do your thing to invoke that intent. So think of this as kind of like a, hey, later on, why don't you do this? And the pending intent, it just kind of holds on to the concept of what we want to do later. Now the notification itself, we're going to use notification compat.builder. And what this does is there's been many, many changes of notification over the years. There are some features that work in older versions of Android that don't work in newer versions. Like there's a set ticker, which would give you some ticker tape text scrolling across the top of the screen. Personally, I really liked this one. And it's something that when a notification came in, it would just kind of scroll across the top telling you what's going on. But they removed it for some reason. And I'm grumpy about that because I actually really liked it. But this notification compat builder inside the set ticker is going to say, if I'm a certain version, just completely ignore this. There's also some things like adding actions to notifications that wouldn't work on older versions of Android. So he does all the thinking behind the scenes to see what version am I, how should I set up my notification based on that version. This is typical of most of the compat classes. So whether you're using a helper class like notification compat or resources compat, or if you're actually subclassing something like app compat activity, it'll bake in some logic like this to see what version am I on, what functions are available, and if the function I'm asking for isn't available, either try to simulate it or ignore it. Let's take a look at the rest of these. So we have the title that's going to be inside that notification, the content intent. Actually, let me just go ahead and pull this up over here. So you can see we have the title, and then the content intent is for clicking here. This small icon is showing up. That's that middle music note. I'm saying set silent true. Normally when you do a foreground notification, it makes a pretty annoying chime sound. And we don't want that to happen when you're starting your music here. So we're going to just request that it be silent. And then the content text is going to be the song with the title on there. Now the rest of these, I'm adding in some actions. And what I did is I set up this extension function, add action if, to kind of make the code a little bit cleaner for these three things that I'm setting up. So let's go take a look at him. We'll see that this guy is an extension on that notification compat builder. I'm passing in some predicate that I want to test, some action ID I want to use for the broadcast intent that's being set up. That's used so that the system can replace that specific intent. Now you don't have to worry about it being unique across the system. It only has to be unique across your application because it's using this context to key that off. So within this context, this action ID has to be unique so that if I set it up multiple times, we won't add multiple things, we'll replace them. When I'm setting up the intent in here, I'm converting that action ID to that action using that stuff from the common code. I also have an icon and a title, which are being used in the normal add action call that's defined on notification compat.builder. So he's going to set it up an action with an icon. That's going to be one of these little icons here. A string for it. So I believe if we long press, nope, that just ended up, yeah, that's kind of neat. That took me to the, you can see this is the first time I've done this, right? You can see this is actually taking us to tell us, do you want to silence these notifications? That's kind of cool. I'm going to say done. In a lot of places in Android, if you long press on an icon, it'll give you a title. Normally, this text will appear in place of these buttons, but I'm using the media style here, which presents these buttons and allows them to be in the compact version as well as the expanded version. If I didn't use a media style, I'd only see play and stop as text underneath the expanded version. If I collapsed, it wouldn't have these buttons. So yay, media style, he's helpful. And we'll go back up here again. So the setup for this, for adding the action, is the icon, the string, and then the pending intent that you want to use. Note that I'm using get broadcast, so this is capturing the concept that I'm going to do a send broadcast on this intent when the button is clicked. I'm also doing a set package here, which means that I'm only going to ever want to send this intent to anything listening inside my package. So it won't actually broadcast it to the entire system, it'll only broadcast it within my application. Then putting the song and the title in there to keep track of them, grabbing the intent flags that were set up before, and poof, now I have that set up. And this is only done if that predicate is true. So this makes it a little bit cleaner down here where I can do this add action if state is paused or state is stopped. I'm going to add the play action with the play arrow and play. For this one, if I'm playing, I'm going to have the pause button. For this one, If I'm paused or playing, I'm going to have the stop button. So finally, the style down here. The reason I have a little switch here for playing or paused is this style allows us to set which actions are shown in the compact view. Note that this first one here, because this is an action if, and these two are mutually exclusive, one of these is going to be button 0, the other one is going to be button 1. But button 1 only shows up if we're paused or playing. So that's why I have this set up here. If we're paused or playing, we want 0 and 1. Otherwise, we just want 0. Now, we actually had to fully qualify this notification compat here because it's actually a different notification compat than the one that I have imported right now. So I'm pulling that in just to get the media style. Once that's all done, we build that notification, so it'll create the notification. And then we call start foreground. Now with notifications, you'd normally say notification manager dot send notification. The start foreground is special because it links this to the service so that if the service dies, the notification will be canceled as well. Finally, when we actually are destroying this service, I want to unregister the receiver, I want to clean up the media player, and then I want to destroy. So that's the service, not a whole lot going on there. Let's take a look at the music activity. Now this music activity is just going to have the buttons on the screen and the text on the screen. So I start off with let's go down to our UE function here. So our UE composable function here has a text at the top with that copyright text, and then a row of buttons. And based on the state we're in, if we're playing or not, we do pause or play. And if we're not stopped, we do stop. So we're just displaying buttons on the screen, pretty simple. With each of these buttons here, I created a little state button helper who I can pass in this onStateChange function. He gets this new state for each individual button. It's saying which state he represents, and when it's clicked, we're just going to pass that into onStateChange. So that onStateChange can then actually change our state, notify anybody else, whatever we want to do. So that's what our state buttons are doing. One for paused, one for playing, one for stopped, saying which states we want to go into. If we come back up here, we'll see that when we set up our UE, we pass in the current state, and then the onStateChanged function here says when the state changes, set that to be the current state, and then I'm going to call start service, passing in the different action for each one. And this is a start service that I've overridden to call the service passing in an intent for pause, play, and stop. So let's take a look at that start service. We get our action code. I'm going to say context compat start foreground service. And this is needed because at some point you didn't need to set this foreground notification. So if we go and take a look inside of him, we'll see that if the API is greater than or equal to 26, we're calling start foreground service. Otherwise, we're just calling start service just normally to kick it off. So he's going to set up an intent that explicitly says, I want to go for the remote music service inside this application. And here's some data that I want to send along the line. So I'm actually passing in that raw for the music, passing in the action code, and passing in the title. If you're doing a real music application, you'd have some controls in the application to choose which song you want to actually run, and then use that instead of passing in the song this way. We're setting up a little broadcast receiver here just to keep track of the buttons on the screen. So if we're receiving the notification from the buttons in the notification, well, so receiving a broadcast from the buttons in the notification for action play, action pause, or action stop, we're just going to change our state, which is going to update which buttons are visible on the screen. That way we can keep the buttons inside the activity in sync with the buttons in the notification. Finally, when we're destroying, unregister our receiver. And that's it. This is our full music application. So that's an example of a started service, one that we're kicking off to have something continue even though the activity isn't still being shown on the screen. Now let's take a look at a bound service. And the way I've defined this bound service is really intended for use in a separate application. I just kept them together in one application here just for ease of the example. When you're doing your assignment, you're going to want to create a separate application that has just this service stuff in it. And it's going to need to have a copy of the AIDL as well as the client having a copy of the AIDL and any type of objects that you need to access there. So let's start by looking at the AIDL here. This is the Android Interface Design Language, and it's going to describe this communication with this service. Let's take a look at the remote service first. And we'll see that this guy has three functions: reset, add a remote service reporter, and remove a remote service reporter. Now notice this is closer to Java syntax than Kotlin. And what we're trying to do is this service is just going to spin and increment a number and then call this reporter with that number and some people just to pass it down the line. So we need to look at what that remote service reporter looks like. This describes a reporter who's going to receive a list of people and an integer. So these are coming back to him, being that list of people and an integer. Now in order for this to work, list is okay, but the type of the items has to be defined in the AIDL. So if we take a look at person.aidl here, we see parcelable person. Note there's nothing else here. This is just telling us that somewhere there's a comJavaDude service.person class that's parcelable. So it's kind of a promise to AIDL that that's the case. So let's take a look at person and see what he looks like. Note that this guy, I'm using the parcelize annotation in Kotlin in order to generate a whole bunch of other code over here. This is the code here to make something be parcelable. We set up a companion object, which is similar to static functions inside Java. So we're going to have this creator field, which is going to be a static field. And his whole purpose is to be able to recreate a person from a parcel. So we're going to read from a parcel, and then create the person object. He also is responsible for creating an array if you had passed an array of people. At the write to parcel down here, this definition in parcelable is just going to write these fields out. Now when you use this at parcelize, it's going to generate all these for the fields that are listed inside the primary constructor. So that's our person class there. That'll be used here to transfer back and forth. And let's take a look at our service implementation. So before we really dig any deeper into this, let's actually take a look at what this looks like when we run it. Let me bring up the manifest here, and I'm going to comment out the music activity up here so that it'll hit the main activity. Whatever the first defined activity that has the action main category launcher, that's the first one that's the one that's going to be run when you hit the run button up here at the top by default. So I'm just going to go ahead and run that. And here's what this application looks like. It's just got a reset button at the top, a little progress bar showing progress, and the people that are being sent back showing their age. So it's actually, each time this is being updated, it's sending a new instance of those people. So let's take a look at the code behind this now. In the remote service here, we're going to have a list of reporters. So when somebody says they want to add a reporter, we're keeping track of it. We're going to have a coroutine scope that we're creating here for IO dispatcher. And we're going to keep track of which job was created when the coroutine scope is being used to launch a coroutine. I is my little counter here that I'm going to increment. And I'm making it volatile because we might be hitting it from multiple threads. This just makes it easier to manage rather than having to try to do some thread synchronization. In this particular application, this is perfectly fine. What volatile does is it makes sure that every time a thread wants to read a value of the variable, it always goes back to storage. It doesn't look at a cache. If we didn't have it volatile, threads are allowed to actually cache values temporarily. So you could have some slight out of sync situations between two different threads. Volatile just makes sure that it's always writing to memory and always reading from memory. So now we define our API here This is going to be an implementation of that remote service. So we have those three functions, the reset, add, and remove. Reset is just going to reset that value to 1. Add is going to add the reporter to the reporters list, and remove is going to remove it from the reporters list. So it's a pretty straightforward little API that we're defining there. This binder is going to be returned at the end of the onBind function. So this is how we provide our API to the client, is via this onBind. If you noticed in our remote music service down at the bottom, onBind was returning null, meaning he's not bindable. You can't bind him. So now that we've got our binder set up there, let's take a look at our onBind function here. We'll come to onDestroy after. And what I'm going to do is say if I don't have a job, then I want to launch one, because I only want to have one of these counter jobs going. I don't want to restart every time somebody binds, because we could have multiple things binding over time. So we're going to launch this guy, make him go forever, and we're going to create a list of people who have an age of I plus 10 or I plus 5, so whatever I is, we're just going to add to it. And then for each reporter, we're just going to say, hey, reporter, I'm going to send you a report of the people and the current value of I. After we send all the reports to all the reporters, we're going to delay for a moment and then increment I. Lather, rinse, repeat. Boom, we just keep notifying them. When we destroy this service, we want to cancel any job that's in progress. So if we have a job, cancel it. And hopefully we'll have one, because we've hopefully at least bound once. And then we do the destroy. And that's the end of this guy. So this is pretty simple, just spinning and doing this loop, calling back the callback that was registered. Now to the main activity. This is the one that's actually going to do the work with this particular service. So here's where we're going to keep track of that binder once we have a hold of it. And the way we get a hold of it is through something called a service connection object. We're going to attempt to connect to this service, to bind to this service. And when that connection has been established, the service connection is going to be notified. He'll be notified when the service actually got connected, and he'll be notified when the service actually got disconnected. So disconnected, we're just going to clear the binder. Connected, we're going to actually set that binder. Let's find the remote service stub. That's the client side of this thing. And I'm going to convert this binder into one of those stubs. And all that conversion is doing is basically a cast. So that'll give us the binder that we can talk to. Then I'm going to immediately call add reporter. And you're going to do something similar to this in your homework. Once you've got your service connection, that's when you want to actually start listening to it. You don't want to try to do this add reporter anywhere else. So now for our user interface, we're going to keep track of the progress that we want to display and the list of people. Well, in this case, we're actually just going to keep track of a list of the people's names, comma, separated as a string. So for our user interface, we're going to have a UE that takes in both of those states. And when the reset button's pressed, we're going to call binder, if we have one, .reset. That'll send off to the service, reset the number, which should then do a callback to tell us the current state the next time it hits that part of the loop. Here's our reporter that we're actually going to pass over. So he's going to be remote service reporter.stub. So we're passing our stub over to the service so that he can use that as a client to talk to us. When we get a report, we're going to set the state to be whatever that number is. And we're going to set the people state to just be a comma separated list of people with their age. For this particular application, I chose to bind the service in onStart and unbind it in onStop. And in a lot of cases, this is actually going to work really well. For your assignment, this is not going to work well. For your assignment, you actually have a map that you have to wait for to be ready before you start connecting. If you connect too soon, you may miss some of the information that you need to put onto the map. In particular, if you see the letter U show up as part of your message as opposed to the letter O, then you've actually missed an event coming across there. What you really want to do is make sure you don't do this bind service until the map is ready. So in your onMap ready block after you do your await. So we'll see here the intent is very similar. We're just going to have the name of the service and the current package context. So it's this service in this application. And I'm going to call bind to it, passing in that service connection so I can be notified when the connection's been established. And I'm passing a flag in here to say create the service if it isn't already running. In our onStop, we're going to remove the reporter from the binder, then unbind from the service, and then we're done. So that's the entire application here. The little user interface here just has the little reset button, linear progress indicator to show our progress, and the text with the people inside of it. So that's a nice little example of using a bound service where we connect to it, we can set up a callback, and then the service can end up poking us whenever it needs to, and then we respond to it.